Hi, here we are at Chapter 17 and earnings per share and retained earnings. So we're going to look at the equity section of the balance sheet and take a look at the income statement for earnings per share. So the exercises we're going to be looking at are the impact of earnings per share, or EPS, and the diluted earnings per share, and the rankings and how we pull those out. We'll also look at share options, various types of dividends, and then the changes in stockholders' equity. And we need an apostrophe there. So let's kind of do an overview of the earnings per share. First of all, we need to kind of understand the income statement format. You're going to have an income or a loss from continuing operations, and then you're going to include discontinued operations, and then gains and losses. Also included on that income statement is going to be your earnings per share, along with the DEP, which is the diluted earnings per share. So what are the uses of the earnings per share? It's a fairly popular evaluation of a company, so it's really very, very important. It's relevant for evaluating the return on investment and the risk of the corporation. And you'll see this used very often on Wall Street, so it's good to know about it, and it's good to know how to figure it. So what do we look at? What do we need to do to put this together? Well, first of all, we have to reveal the amount of the EPS, just what its ratio is. We look at the change in the EPS from year to year, and then we look at the trends. Is it continually going up? Is it going down? Is there a seasonal tick to it? So we'll look at those three areas. And the last thing we look at, it's not really shown on the income statement. In fact, they discourage it being shown, but is the cash flow per EPS. And that just may be an indication of future cash flow of the company. So we have to be kind of aware of that. The price-earnings ratio equals the EPS divided by the market price share. And this kind of just gives you a ratio so you can compare across companies. The book uses a really good, what I consider, illustration is pennies versus Kohl's. Those are very telling EPS, because pennies is experiencing extreme distress right now, and Kohl's is still going gangbusters. So it'd be interesting to look at those two financial reports and just kind of see what the difference was in 2010. Might make a good research project for some time, especially now that we know pennies is having some issues. One caution, and this is always a caution, when you're comparing company to company, make sure those EPSs are comparable. Sometimes they don't have the same data or use the same way, so always make sure you check your notes. So what is the basic EPS? Well, your basic EPS is the net income minus preferred dividends divided by the weighted average of common stocks that are outstanding at the time or during the year. So only the amount of earnings, okay, that's available to the common shareholder is used. So we have to be very careful what we include in those earnings. Also, you're going to use a weighted average of shares throughout the period, and you're going to use a layering, such as maybe 2 months you'll have 10,000 outstanding, and 3 months you'll have 12,000 outstanding, and 6 months you will have 20,000 outstanding. You're going to take an average of those using that method. And there's a really good example of that on page 482, exercise or example 17.1. If you want to take a look at that, you're going to look at stock dividends and splits, and they've got to be considered in this in this calculation, and a good example of that is 17.2 on page 843. So what are the components of the EPS? Well, it must show, and this is kind of interesting, you're going to show a breakdown of it, of continuing operations, discontinued operations, and extraordinary gains and losses. So you're going to have 3 areas that are going to break it down. And then you also have to make sure you include information in the notes to the financial statements. This is a very important number. Page 844, 17-3 is a really good overall example of the basics earnings per share and how you lay it out. So make sure you take a look at that and mark it. It may come in handy. Finally, we need to look at diluted EPS, or DEPS, which is the effects of potential common stocks. And what that means is we may have options, we may have warrants, and we may have convertible preferred stock and bonds that can be converted at a moment's notice into a common stock. So you kind of have to add that into the equation as you're figuring out what the true EPS is. We're going to do an exercise in figuring diluted earnings per share. We also then need to look at disclosures. You want to look at, provide a schedule for identifying and recording the factors involved in the calculation of both of these. You want to tell people how you got those numbers. We're going to describe what potential common stock was not included and why. And then you're going to have to look at, after the financials have been made, but before they've been published, if there's any subsequent events that will affect the EPS or the DEP. So those are 3 things that really need to be watched for in the disclosures. A very good example of that is on page 853, report 17-1. Finally, in this chapter, we look at the earnings, retained earnings. And retained earnings, of course, is that link between the income statement and the balance sheet. So it kind of links the two together. Factors affecting the retained earnings are net income, dividends that we declare. You have to be very careful about meeting the legal requirements before the dividends are issued. You have prior period adjustments that are going to be in or affect the retained earnings, and then appropriations. We're going to go back to this legal capital. There are times when a board will declare a certain amount of retained earnings not available for distribution, and these are the appropriations here. We will look at dividends and different types of dividends. We've got cash dividends, you've got property dividends, you've got scrip dividends, which are a promissory note to pay future dividends. You've got a stock dividend, you have liquidating dividends, and then you have stock splits. Now, they don't affect anything because when things split, it's just exponential. But you still have to consider those, and you also have to put those in the notes, so make sure your disclosures are right. Prior period adjustments, we're not going to do too much with those in this chapter, but when we get to the last chapter, we're going to look at those with the corrections, and they always are going to affect the retained earnings. Ultimately, everything does, I think, in the end. Then we'll look at a retained earnings statements, and there's a good example on example 17.7. And there's a report on 17.2, and those are on page 861. So we take a brief look at those. Finally, we'll look at the changes in owner's equity statement, and we're going to do an exercise on that. So please be sure to review the hints in this chapter and look at the example on page 869. It's example 17.8 and 17.9. That kind of wraps up this chapter. This is kind of an interesting chapter. It's short, but the earnings per share is a very important number, so make sure you understand how this is used. Thank you.